This is the Heroic Voice, where I talk to comic book creators, people I've worked with, other interesting people, about the history of comics, superheroes, and the current state of the comic book industry. I also discuss current and upcoming projects, current events, and any other topics my guests might be interested in talking about. So subscribe and hit the like button. Help me grow this channel and promote indie comic book creators, publishers, and other people affiliated with the comic book industry. Your comments are appreciated. Get to it and leave feedback, good, bad, and otherwise. I am your host, Dennis Mallonee, writer, publisher of the Heroic Multiverse, where we spotlight good girls, bad girls, super babes, and superheroics in a classic, kind of golden agey style. Grab some snacks and enjoy. This is the Heroic Voice. Welcome to the Heroic Voice. My guest today is Tom Brevoort, who has a very long and convoluted title at Marvel these days after spending decades as the editor of the Avengers related comic book line. Tom, hello. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad you're here. It's been too long since we've spoken. Our paths just never seem to cross. I'm on the West Coast, you're on the East Coast. I don't travel east, and you rarely get out here. You were at San Diego this year. That's what, the first time in how many years?
I was first time in
Nine.
9 years.
Oh my goodness. For the benefit of the fans who are watching this, what is your official title these days at Marvel?
My full title is Vice President of Publishing, Executive Editor, Conductor of X.
That is a mouthful. Oh my goodness. Um, I asked this just about everybody that I've interviewed so far for the first time.
Mhm.
How did you get interested in comics? What made you decide that you wanted to be in the comic book industry? And how the heck did you manage to wangle your first job?
All right, that's a long answer to a long question. So I started reading comics when I was 6. My dad was a frequent smoker, not quite a chain smoker, but pretty close. He would go through, 2 cartons of cigarettes a week easily, and that meant that he had to restock on the regular. And so, he would go to local 7-Elevens and candy stores and whatnot to buy smokes. And so one day he and I, went to the 7-Eleven. He was going to pick up his cartons. And that day, for some reason, I assume there had been some kind of spill or mishap or something. The comic book spinner rack, rather than being in, sort of off to the side and in the back with the rest of the magazines, as it usually was instead up front near to the door, which is a terrible place to put it because it was entirely too easy for people to just like pick up a book and out the door. Either way, this caught my attention. I started kind of looking at it as a 6-year-old, and my dad said, "Do you want a comic?" And the phrase "Do you want a" only ever had one answer. Um, so I said yes, and so I bought my first comic, which was Superman number 268. And from there, I kept buying them, or I kept getting them bought for me in those early days, because as I say, I was only 6, and it would be a while before I could be buying stuff on my own.
What was in Superman number 268?
It's a fairly forgettable issue all around. It's got a great purple Nick Cardy cover that's done from a sketch by Carmine Infantino. I actually have the original printer's proof. I bought it from the Julie Schwartz estate 20 years ago. So I've got that framed upstairs. It's Wild Weekend in Washington. It's the first team up between Superman and Batgirl. Uh,
Really?
Batman sets Superman up to go visit his pal, Congresswoman Barbara Gordon, when he is in Washington, and they get involved with some spies, and it's a completely forgettable tale. And the backup is a Tales of Krypton story that is so forgettable that even though I've read it maybe a dozen times over the years since I was 6 years old, I still couldn't tell you what the hell it was about.
The first comic book that I ever bought was Action number 259, which was one of the early Supergirl
Mhm.
issues. I remember reading, although I didn't buy it, an issue of Action Comics that had a Tommy Tomorrow story in it, right? And so when Tommy Tomorrow sort of appeared in a Supergirl story a couple of months later, because Jim Mooney was the artist of both, and I
Right.
imagine he just wanted to, throw Tommy Tomorrow in there for some reason. I was struck by the fact that, wait, Tommy Tomorrow is not appearing in Action Comics anymore. What's he doing here? Yeah. So it's those little things that catch your eye when you're a youngster.
Sure.
My brother had a bunch of Marvel comic books in his room. I picked up a few of them and read them. Journey into Mystery number 85, first appearance of Loki, right? The first Marvel comic I ever bought was Fantastic Four number 10, um, which was
Return of Doctor Doom.
yes, the return of Doctor Doom. And I remember being struck by the fact that Stan and Jack were in the story.
Right.
And I thought that was,
But you never see their faces.
you
They
never
keep their
do.
faces covered in that for obscure reasons lost to time.
Okay. So, what made you decide that you wanted to be in the comic book industry and how did you get in?
Well, from six, as soon as I started reading comics, I started drawing comics, making my own, crude, a piece of typing paper folded in half comics. And this continued, all through my growing up years. I went to college at the University of Delaware in their illustration program, and from there, I ended up getting an internship at Marvel in 1989, summer of 1989, and I was pretty good at it. I dare say that I peaked as an intern, and I was good enough that people wanted to hire me on staff. And so a couple of months later, when an opening came up, I was hired in and I started at Marvel as an assistant editor the last week of 1989, December 27th.
You
I
remember, do
remember it, I remember it's December 28th, but the records say December 27th. So that they're probably right, and I'm probably misremembering that.
you remember what your first official job was? What,
Uh, as an intern,
yeah,
the first week, I mean, I did a lot of things. I worked across three different editorial offices, but the big one was there had been an enormous backlog of submissions. So many they filled a closet out in the hall, and they were all under assistant editor Evan Skolnick's desk, and they just been piling up for 18 months, 2 years, and they needed to be gone through. And basically, the folks in the editorial office, Greg Wright and Evan Skolnick, said, "Well, look, whenever you're not doing anything else, start going through these. Most of them are just going to get a fairly standard rejection letter because most of it's going to be completely unusable. Anything that seems like there's maybe something to it, you can pass up the chain to us, and we can circulate it to the rest of the editorial group if it does seem to have something to it." And they expected that to take a long while, and by the end of the first week, I was done.
Stan did that to them. How to Do Comics the Marvel Way was that book that Stan produced was what generated all of those.
A lot of them, sure, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Plenty of people have been hired out of samples of that sort, particularly on the art side. Less the writers, because it's impossible to really judge a writer by a small sample like that. But
Absolutely.
artists, you could look and see right away. Oh, that person has something.
It's got something, some potential. I remember when Barry Smith walked in the door, you know, Stan saw something in him. It was really crude stuff because he was drawing sitting on a park bench in Central Park, right? He didn't have
Yep,
a studio. He just came in with some stuff he'd sketched out. And I remember Stan telling me, right, he drew kind of like Jack Kirby, so I wanted to see what he could do. And then that's how Barry Smith got hired.
right.
Yeah. Um, when did you first get onto the Avengers? I mean, you had to have started on it before you became the editor of the line. Do you remember when that happened?
No. I started on Avengers in end of 1997.
Mhm.
Avengers had been taken out of house. It had been farmed out
Right.
to Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld as part of the Heroes Reborn deal, and I got it when it came back. And so that was my first time editing Avengers. Was again tail end of '97. What
Bringing
was
it
then
back
called
into the Marvel Universe.
yeah, what was then called Heroes Return. Um, and I got it. I wasn't supposed to get Avengers. I was supposed to be doing Iron Man because Kurt Busiek was going to write Iron Man, and I had a good working relationship with Kurt from having done Thunderbolts and Untold Tales of Spider-Man, and things of that sort over the years. But then, they had reached out. The editor in chief Bob Harris and particularly editor Ralph Macchio had reached out to George Perez about coming back and doing Avengers. And George didn't feel like he was qualified at that point to write it because he'd been out of the Marvel Universe for so long. He wasn't familiar with the continuity. So he asked for either Mark Waid or Kurt Busiek to write the book, and they called Kurt first. And so once the two of them were on board and on the book together, between the two of them, they realized or thought that I would be a help because I knew the world pretty well. And so they went to Bob and said, "Hey, could we have Tom edit Avengers?" And Bob agreed to that, and so I got Avengers, and I ended up passing Iron Man over to Bobby Chase. But yeah, so I got Avengers then, and then I edited it for 26 years.
Did you have any notion at all how long you would be doing that?
Oh no, of course
No,
not. Honestly, nobody edits a title for 26 years.
nobody
There are
does,
very there are
except for Stan. Stan,
it's yeah, and even Stan, most of the titles Stan edited for like a dozen years.
uh,
The only title that he did that has a longer run than me on Avengers is Millie the Model. And it's kind of a cheat because there are places where Millie didn't come out that often or had little breaks or whatnot. But Millie
yeah,
the Model from 1944 to 1972, I think it is. That's the only Marvel run that's longer editorially than mine on Avengers.
wow.
Over at DC, you can find one or two as well, and
Yeah,
things like
Julie had a very long run on a lot of his titles. So
yeah. But I beat them all. I beat them all. The only folks that kind of have me lapped are folks like Al Feldstein on Mad.
mhm.
Um, and there are a couple. Bob Kanigher on Wonder Woman, I think,
Yeah,
is
long time.
slightly longer.
Yeah,
But even Julie on something like Flash, even if you take into account the years that he edited the Golden Age Flash and don't count the gap years when there was no Flash, I still did Avengers longer.
cool. That is so cool. Let's talk a little history, maybe touch on some things that fans may not be aware of. Way back in the day, right? That first issue of Avengers, do you know how that came about?
Of
That first
course I
issue of
did.
Avengers?
I helped let people in the world know about that as I put it all together from talking to people in the field as I got in and was interested. That Avengers was an emergency
Accident.
creation.
Yes.
Not
Mhm.
necessarily an accident, but it was an emergency creation. Originally, as the Marvel book started to become a success, Martin Goodman, whose whole stock in trade as a publisher in the 40s and 50s was to find a trend that was working and then put out as many copies of it as he could in a short period of time to capture the market. And then when they stopped selling, cut them all and replace them with something else.
One other
So
aspect of Martin, right, that should be
mhm.
touched on here because you're going to get to it in a moment, is the fact that he liked to steal names, right? Any character that was no longer being published that, it didn't have a copyright or had fallen out of copyright, Martin would tell Stan, do something with this name.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, in the
go,
case, yeah. So in at the point of 1963, most of the early Marvel books had been started. But there was there was this moment when everybody had realized clearly the two that are selling the best are Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, head and shoulders above all the other sales. So Martin went and said, "Give me another Fantastic Four and another Spider-Man," and that was the marching order. And the other Fantastic Four turned out to be X-Men, which
In
evolved
this
in.
fabulous Fantastic Four style.
Yes, exactly, as it was blurbed on that first issue. Yeah, and that it evolved into something quite different. But if you look at that first issue, it's five characters all wearing identical costumes like the Fantastic Four. The Beast, personality wise, is very similar to the Thing, and it's following that sort of a pattern. Even Magneto as their first villain is sort of reminiscent of Doctor Doom. So the idea was do Fantastic Four, but another one. And in the case of Spider-Man, do give me another Spider-Man. And in particular, as you mentioned, Martin had become aware that the rights had lapsed to the Golden Age character Daredevil that had been published by Lev Gleason and mostly creatively driven by Charlie Biro. Big success in the 40s and 50s. And so, he let Stan know this, and Stan set out to do Daredevil. And, he talked to a couple of people, and Steve Ditko turned it down. He didn't want to do it. And he said that Stan basically said, you can just do the old Daredevil. You can just bring back something that looks like the old Daredevil, or we can do something completely new, whatever you want to do. But Ditko wasn't interested in it. And Kirby either wasn't interested in it or had a full enough plate that he couldn't take another book on. So Stan ended up reaching out to Bill Everett, who at the time was working at a greeting card company up in New England. He sort of was out of comics, but he'd been a mainstay of the Marvel bullpen going back to the 30s and the first Marvel comics with the
And throughout the
Submariner.
1950s as well, after he came back from the service.
Oh yeah, big contributor all the way through into the 50s, doing a lot of horror stuff in particular. And so, Stan and Bill Everett worked out Daredevil, and Daredevil was intended to be a Spider-Man like crime fighter. He'd fight
But
weird villains and be ground level, and not a teenager. He'd have a different shtick, but the idea was do something that looks and feels like Spider-Man, so we can have another Spider-Man. And the problem was that Everett was not the fastest guy in the world, and especially working a day job and then trying to get the book done at night, he couldn't do it. And in those days, you booked your press time ahead of time, and whether you had something to print or not, you paid for it. So there was a slot on Marvel's schedule that needed to be filled with something. 22 pages of something had to be there to print, or they were going to pay for it anyway. And so, in under sort of panicked conditions, Stan called up Kirby and said, "We need a new book, and we need it in like 2.5 weeks. What do we do?" And he and Kirby worked out Avengers. And Avengers is all, if you look at the first issue in particularly, it's completely made up of pieces that they'd already come up with. The villain is Loki. The setup is, here's all these characters that you already know coming together as a team, Justice League style. And
just a society style. These were
yeah,
the characters who did not have their own titles.
I I guess you could say that they were all featured
In the anthology
the
books,
anthology
Tales
books.
of Suspense, Journey into Mystery, Tales to Astonish, and the
Yeah,
Hulk's book had been canceled.
yes. Again, I tend to think they were probably thinking more Justice League because that was the contemporary book. That was the thing
Mhm.
that was on sale at the time. But you're absolutely right about that. And so, Kirby sat down, penciled 22 pages. Dick Ayers, the inking on that book seems incredibly crude if you actually stare at it, because Dick was no doubt inking at a furious pace to get it done. And that book came out and took the spot of Daredevil on the schedule. Came out the same day as X-Men 1, which I believe was September 4th, 1963. And then Daredevil, came out about
4 months later.
3 months later.
Yeah.
Yeah, late December. I think it's December 28th, but don't quote me on that. I might be off by a day or two.
And that fans is how the Avengers happened. Something like it would doubtless have happened eventually, but
And I'm
and
sure
then,
it's the kind of thing that they were probably thinking of at
yeah,
some point. We'll put all the characters together in a group, but that's also why you don't get any of the Ditko characters. It's solely Kirby characters. There's no Doctor Strange. There's no Spider-Man. As far as anybody can tell, there was never any talk about using the Ditko characters in it. It was all stuff that Jack was instantly familiar with and could hit the ground running on, and wouldn't have had to do any sort of background or research. You could just go. He could be penciling that next day. Um, and then they took a couple of issues to figure out what the heck it actually was.
hmm
And eventually, probably around issue 6 or so, it kind of crystallized into being okay. Here's what Avengers is like. But
yeah.
it was like most of the Marvel books. It was fairly experimental in its earliest issues,
I remember
trying to
reading,
figure out.
I remember reading that first issue and thinking, okay, this is kind of cool, but you know, okay, Loki uses the Hulk. Okay, I guess so. And then the second issue came out with the Space Phantom, and that made no sense. Absolutely no sense to me, right?
Mm,
Oh, I've defeated you because I'm a god and your power doesn't work on me.
yep, yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, all right. That's kind of hand waving, but we can live with that. The third issue, though, was actually pretty cool, right?
Yeah,
Submariner and the
Hulk and
Hulk.
Submariner. Yeah,
Yes, Submariner and the Hulk fighting the other Avengers. And then, as you say, they weren't clear on what they were doing, but clearly Jack wanted to bring back Captain America, and maybe Stan wanted to bring him back, so they did. Um, you know, and like you said, it wasn't until issue, the Masters of Evil book that they
yeah. That's
really
6.
figured,
It's
yeah.
about 6 that it kind of clicks
uh,
into place, and they kind of understand what they're doing.
yeah. And then, Stan decided that he didn't want to have to deal with continuity crossovers with Thor and Iron Man and yanked them out of the book,
Yep. Yes, he did.
along with Giant Man, who was being dropped from Tales to Astonish.
Yeah, he did his best, but he failed. He failed as Ant-Man. He failed as Ant-Man and the Wasp. He failed as Giant Man. He failed as the new Giant Man. He was done for a while.
Yeah.
So he was out, and they did that massive overhaul in Avengers 16, where instead they left Cap in the book and they brought in Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch and Hawkeye, all three of whom had debuted as villains in other strips. Hawkeye in the Iron Man strip and Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch in X-Men, and they were always somewhat sympathetic
Yes, I was going to say the
villains.
very word.
And so the idea of redeeming them and turning them into heroes, clearly they must have been popular. Like Stan must have been getting some feedback, mail or whatnot from the audience saying that they liked and were interested in those characters. But the other thing that really happens with Avengers 16 is that's the point where it becomes a Marvel book.
Yes.
Before that, like it was a fine, fun sort of rompy book, but there wasn't a whole lot of characterization in it. It wasn't a big emphasis. It was much more of an action comic than anything. And as soon as you get down to the new Avengers who have to, prove their spurs and who pound for pound are a lot less overtly powerful than the old Avengers. The way those characters interact with one another, the dynamic as they argue and sometimes snipe and sometimes compete with one another. That was much more in the formula that Stan was refining for what made a Marvel book different. And so it really kind of became a Marvel title for real at that point.
The personality traits that Stan really emphasized at the time were the Hawkeye Captain America clash, where Hawkeye chafed, being under the, tutelage of this old guy who wasn't really old, but he'd been around sort of since World War II. And I mentioned the idea of Stan pulling Thor and Iron Man out because he didn't have to deal with continuity issues of having them in the Avengers at the same time he was trying to tell stories in their own book. That actually came up Stan toyed with the idea of a Captain America Scarlet Witch romance, but then Jack introduced Agent 13 in the Captain America comic as Cap's love interest. And that whole potential storyline that Stan seemed to be toying with just disappeared. Right? You remember that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's very similar to a lot of things in the early books. Stan would sort of poke around at things and see what worked, whatever felt good to him at the moment. He would experiment with or try or drop a line or a tease or whatnot. And the stuff that either felt the best to him or that got the best response from the audience, he would steer into more. So I don't know how serious long term he was with building a Cap Scarlet Witch romance. It always seemed to be much more one-sided. That Wanda certainly liked looking at Cap, but Cap didn't particularly seem to have any reaction to
Yeah.
looking at
Well, he
Wanda.
he couldn't. He was in charge, right? He was
Right.
determining the Avengers. You can't, have a relationship with a subordinate. It's
Sure,
not it's
sure.
not proper.
Of course. So again, like that certainly was a situation that could have been developed further. But as you say, they took Cap in a different direction in his own strip, and so Avengers followed suit.
Mhm. Giant Man and the Wasp came back.
Yep.
Do you know it? I don't know why Stan decided to do that. Do you have any clue as to why he decided to bring them back at that point?
I think much like the Hulk, everything that they had, character wise and story wise, was raw material. It was always easier to bring something back than to come up with something whole cloth. And as I say, the kooky quartet Avengers, they were a little underpowered for an Avengers team, and Stan in particular seemed to realize early on that the strong guy character in all the books seemed to be the one that readers took to their hearts the most. It was a very central position, in part because of the popularity of the thing. So I think bringing Giant Man back and rebuilding him as Goliath, trying to give him a little tragedy in that he's stuck at giant size, and not having a solo strip so that all of that soap opera agita can be played out in the pages of Avengers was basically bringing in a strong guy to be a part of that lineup and give them a little more power, and also somebody who he hoped the audiences would click with in that role. And they never entirely did, although I liked Hank Pym as Goliath in those days. But it made him and the Wasp, it put them back on the canvas and made them once again important characters in the Marvel universe, and kept them alive and kept them going, much as Avengers had done for the Hulk at the beginning.
You mentioned the tragic problem that Goliath had with not being able to get back to normal size. That was a consistent pattern. Almost every one of Stan's creations and Jack's creations had some personal issue, some personal problem, whether it's being lame or being blind, right, or having a horrible, social life, or being stuck as the thing, right. The only one I can think of who didn't really seem to have any kind of real issue was the Torch at the time. The Torch had
Yeah,
everything going for him, um,
I
popular,
think
handsome, mechanic, right? Um,
I think that's fair, and probably as much as anything, the reason it's not there for the Torch is the Torch was created, at the real, beginning of the first wave, and before, Lee had kind of codified for himself what the formula was, what's working about this thing that we're making. Plus, I think basically the thing sucked up all the oxygen for that in Fantastic Four. Like there just wasn't enough room, with him doing that, and Reed having the love triangle with Sue and Namor. The Torch just being the Torch, even though he had his weird oddball strip in Strange Tales. There just didn't seem to be a lot of space for him to have much more than, like, some girl problems and the usual he's a bratty teen kid problems, in the main book. Otherwise, it sort of would have been overlapping a little too. It's kind of hard to feel sorry for yourself when you're standing next to the Thing.
Yeah. All right. Let's segue quickly because I try to keep these to about a half an hour or so, and I do want you to talk a little bit more about yourself to what Roy did when he took over the book, right? You mentioned that Goliath didn't really seem to be quite working in that role. He brought in Hercules,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Roy basically, expanded the cast as best he could. He really wanted the Thor and Iron Man back, but
yes,
Stan, for
he
years,
snuck them in at every opportunity.
yeah, but Stan wouldn't let him bring them back, on the regular for at least 4 or 5 years. So he looked to bolster the roster wherever he could. Hercules, I think, as you say, was his first new addition. He had the Black Widow kind of circling around for a long while, in kind of a supporting player role, not on the team, but in the book often enough that she almost was. And then, in rapid succession, like basically he grabbed any character that seemed at loose ends. So much like Hercules, he grabbed the Black Panther
And
after
he
the
got
Panther
rid
was
of Quicksilver
introduced.
and the Scarlet Witch.
Yeah, he wrote them out at least temporarily. I don't know if he'd really intended them to be gone as long as they were. I think that was a case of, he put them on a shelf intending to bring them back at some point, and some point just turned out to be a couple of years longer than he might have thought in the first place. He invented the Vision, and that largely was driven by Stan saying,
We need an android.
come up with a new Avenger and make him an android.
Yeah.
And so he broadened out the roster of the Avengers significantly over his time writing the book. And Roy was the first person that Stan found that could write comics in the way that he wanted them written. He tried a lot of people out in the early days.
Gary
Uh,
Friedrich, Mike Friedrich,
I'm thinking of older guys than
oh,
that. Don Rico
Enrico, yeah, and his brother,
and
Larry.
yeah, and Larry Lieber and Robert Bernstein and Larry Ivy and all these guys, some of whom had been in the business for years, and he just could not quite get the flavor out of them, the understanding of what it was that they were doing, that he wanted. And so they would, write a couple of stories, and then that would be it. Stan would be back
Yeah.
writing or scripting whatever that series was. So it wasn't until Roy that he found somebody that actually understood what he was doing and could duplicate it well enough in his own way, that he was comfortable with it. And then
Roy,
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 as
did, Roy did it slightly differently, different take on it, basically the same thematic elements, but Roy took a different tangent, which I really like because it created some variety in the way the book.
Sure. Roy had a more literary background,
Hmm.
and so he tended to draw a lot from his inspirations, whether they were things he read growing up, or just modern mythology as a whole, or just things that appealed to him. He was a slightly more erudite, and overtly learned Stan. Um,
Yeah. Okay,
so he did.
you. Let's cut that and get to you. What should fans be looking
I
for
was
from
not more
you?
erudite than Stan.
What should we should be what should we be looking for from you, from the books you're doing at Marvel? What's coming up that fans should be particularly interested in?
Well, the thing I'm doing now after 26 years of the Avengers, I have sidled over to running X-Men. And so we're in the process of just launching a whole new flight of X-Men books. The first issues of X-Men and Uncanny X-Men have come out already. The third book, with the X in the title, Exceptional X-Men, drops this coming Wednesday. By the time you hear this, it will have come out already. Um, so really, you can pick up almost any X-Men title and get something that's applicable to me, even if it's edited by one of my junior editors. That's really where my big focus is at the moment. I'm still editing Fantastic Four. So there's also FF, and some other things around the edges. But really, my hands have been elbow deep in X-Men for the last 12 months or so.
What is the not the raison d'etre, but what are you trying to do with the X-Men books? Is this the back to basics thing? Is it expand on what already exists type of thing?
It's a little from column A, a little from column B. The X-Men for the last 5 years have been in the middle of a very progressive and forward-thinking story. We took all the mutants and they formed their own nation of Krakoa, and that became an ongoing thing. And at the end of that story, that nation was disbanded, was sent away, and now mutants, like it or not, have to reintegrate into the rest of society, and deal with problems that they maybe haven't had to deal with in a while. But the intention isn't necessarily to go back to basics. It's to kind of harken back to the sorts of stories that X-Men used to be famous for, but to do it in a new way, in a new fashion. So we're not going back to the Westchester Mansion. The X-Men are scattered in smaller groups of characters across the globe, and each book is designed to be, in terms of tone and in terms of flavor and style, a bit different from all the others. So it's not sort of a consistent flavor across a dozen titles. Hopefully, it's a Baskin Robbins selection where no matter what kind of X-Men characters or stories you like, there's at least some book in the line that will satisfy you and excite you. Um,
Excellent. No,
Beyond that, we're going to build out and build up X-Men. The stated objective that I've said a bunch of times is, X-Men is and has been for years the biggest, most popular franchise in comics. And for the last 10 years or so, for whatever reason, a couple of other things have lapped it, and we're done with that now. Amazing Spider-Man and Batman and whomever better step back a seat, because X-Men is going to be at the forefront again, because it's not hard to do that.
ha.
Even
Okay,
I can
Tom,
do that.
last words on this. Any recommendations beyond X-Men? Any books that you like that fans should pick up? It doesn't have to be a
Oof.
Marvel title. What do you like? Do you still read the things?
Oh, I read more comics than than you could imagine. And that's sort of why I choke up when people ask me this. I'll say this: Jason Shiga's third Adventure Games book is coming out. I think it's in the next week or so, and those are always very great and very intelligent and use the medium in a good way. Anything from the team of Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, they have another new OGN coming out anytime now, but literally just about anything from their back catalog is terrific. Um, there's a ton of stuff. I don't know that I'm going to be able to pull too much more off the top of my head.
Oh, we're running out of time here. So let's wrap this up. I want to thank you very much for your time on this. It is a
Absolutely.
pleasure. We should speak more often than what's it been, like 10, 12 years?
It's been a little while, yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Then good night. I will I will ask people to like and subscribe to the Heroic Voice YouTube channel, because that's the way we're going to be generating some revenue from this. And with that, we will say good night.